Hi, in this video I'm going to walk through the process of getting Git installed on Windows, as well as configuring it to work in VS Code, and finally finishing up with connecting it to GitHub so you can create repositories of code to share with each other and commit those changes when you work on something for somebody else to then clone the repo and make changes themselves to contribute to it. So we're going to have to install a couple tools here. On Windows, Git is not installed by default, and so we're going to install it from the installer you can download on git-scm.com. So this again is only for Windows. We'll do another workflow on Mac, which is equally as easy to do as far as installing it. We'll start with going to Downloads, and you go to Windows, and you want to download the 64-bit Git for Windows file, which I believe just downloaded here. And so I actually have a couple copies, so let me just delete a couple things. Okay, so this is the one I want. So go ahead and double click it, open it, and we'll walk through these install screens. So you kind of accept the defaults for most of these things here, and really the reason we're installing this tool as well, aside from it being the only way to really work with GitHub, is that it's going to install another terminal, which is really a terminal emulator called Git Bash, and it works in a very similar way to what you would expect on a Linux or Mac computer running the terminal application there. So we want to make sure this checkbox where it says Git Bash here is checked, so it installs that. And so we'll click Next, and we want to go ahead and leave. We could choose Visual Studio Code. I'll just leave the default here. Actually, we'll switch it to Visual Studio Code. Use Visual Studio Code as Git's default editor. So go ahead and change it to that. As long as you have it installed, then it should work fine. Click Next. We'll go ahead and say let Git decide. Just your path environment. Leave the recommended chosen here. Choosing SSH executable. Go ahead and leave this on Use Bundled. Open SSH. So just leave that. Go ahead and leave the first option checked here. And we can leave this first option checked here as well. Same with that. Default. Next. Default. And Git Credential Manager Core. Okay, so right here is something that we'll talk about in a second, but we want to make sure this first one is checked. Enable file system caching. Sure, we can leave that checked. Next. Don't turn any experimental options on, and then you click Install. So once this installs, I'll open up the terminal emulator that it installs and show that, and then we'll go over to VS Code and configure the terminal to go there. So I'll go ahead and click Finish, and it's going to show me the release notes. And so what I want to do is go over here to my Windows button and just look right here. You'll see recently added, or if you don't see it, you can type Git, and Git Bash will come up. So let's open that real quick. So what this looks like is a terminal. This is a terminal emulator, which allows me to navigate my file system in a very Linux or Mac OS way, as opposed to the Windows PowerShell. So Windows PowerShell is the Windows terminal, and it looks like this, and it has a different type of command line interface. so it works a different way. But we're installing this because the git bash terminal or mingwin64 terminal, because then all the commands you run here are the same commands as you would run on a Mac or Linux machine. So it's just very useful to get familiar with the terminal that way. So for now, we're not going to do anything with PowerShell. So the first thing I want to do is just type git and see what comes up. So when I do that, I get this printout of all the commands that I can use with git. And so that's how I know it's actually installed. If I type git -- version, I can see what version I have, which is 2.33.0.0 Windows.2. So that's useful to know, to make sure you have the version installed that you downloaded. So we do. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and close that one, because where we want to work and be working is over in VS Code for most things. So I'm going to go to VS Code, and right here at the top you see a terminal drop down. If I click New Terminal, what you get is this terminal interface on the bottom of VS Code. So it's basically the same as the git bash terminal right here, just built into VS Code. But you'll notice by default it chooses PowerShell, which is the Windows terminal. And so what we want to do is go here under this little drop down and click git bash. And so what it's going to do is open up a new terminal, and I can close the PowerShell one. So now I have the same kind of terminal, but it's within VS Code running in here, so I don't have to manage another window open on my desktop anywhere. So the interface looks the same. If I type pwd, it'll show my working directory. Say I want to move to the desktop, cd desktop, pwd, print working directory. So what this is showing is now my cursor, my current folder is the desktop. So that means I can make folders and do things on my computer on the desktop. And I could do the same thing in this one, cd desktop, and it'll go to the desktop as well. So exact same interface here as here. So for now I'm going to close this one because we're not going to use it at all. But I have this terminal here. So one last change you need to make to your PowerShell or to your terminal interface here would be to select the default profile to be git bash instead of PowerShell. So you can see right now PowerShell is default, but we want to change it to git bash. So you say select default profile, and you go up here and you pick git bash. And then if I go under here now, it should say git bash. So if I make a new one, it defaults to a new bash terminal. So that's what we want. So from here, now I can use Git, and I can create a repo, I can manage a repo locally, but the real power with working with Git is with GitHub. And so GitHub is basically a place where you can share code with other people and develop together. You can also find projects on here that are open source, and just lots of really interesting software. So the first thing is, if you don't have an account, you want to go through the sign up process. It's pretty easy, and be sure to pick a username that's something you want to be able to maybe be known for in time, or it's your real name, or it's some kind of alias, but it's something you're going to be typing over and over, so choose wisely. If you have an account, you want to go to sign in and put in your credentials and click sign in. And then this is what you run into, this interface. You have all your repos over here. If you're brand new to GitHub, you won't have anything here yet. And if you're brand new, you won't have much of a social feed. But if you go in here, maybe having been in here a little bit, you'll see some repos that are relevant to your interests and the people you follow. So this is where I end up finding all kinds of interesting projects software-wise. So what we want to do is create a repo and then clone it and then be able to manage it locally and then push some changes back to our repo online. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to actually start off by creating a new repository on GitHub. Go to New, and I'm going to call this one Hello World. I'll say Hello World Windows. Actually, I'll say Hello World Video. I'll just call it Hello World Video. And then I'll just say this is my repo. And you want to say public, and you can, this is optional, but you can click add a README file and create a repository. And adding a README file is important when you want to provide extra information about a project you're working on. So right here you get kind of a quick setup thing, and it's saying, giving you some options of how you can get this repository started. So we will go ahead and I think just do this first quick setup. So I'm going to copy this right here and go to my terminal, and I'm on my desktop, I'm going to say git clone and then paste this in. And so what just happened is, if I type ls, I can see what's on my desktop. What just happened is I got a copy of that folder on my desktop. So it put it right here, Hello World Video. So I can go into that folder now, World Video, and look what's in there. It's just my README. Okay, so that means I have a local copy of this project. So let's click on the title of this here and just go to the repo. So we can see what we have here. This is the project page, the repo page, and I have my README file in here, which is basically this file right here showing me what's going on. And so currently there's nothing in this folder except for my README. But the whole point of this is to be able to work on something locally, commit the changes, and upload them to GitHub so somebody else can also contribute that way. So let's make a file. Actually, first let's open this folder in my editor here. So open folder and go to my desktop, Hello World Video, and just go ahead and say yes, trust the authors. Okay, so we're in this folder right here. I'm gonna go ahead and open my terminal again, just so I can see it here. So this is my README. I want to go ahead and add a new file here. So we're going to call it index.html, because this repo I'm going to also use it as a test case or as a live web page. In some instances, in many instances, you don't really need to do that. You don't really need to use a repo as a web server storage space, but in this case I'm going to do that just because we're talking about web development, talking about a repo and sharing files. So I'm going to go ahead and just make a HTML file and put a little code in here. So I have the head, and I'll do the body, and I'll just do an H1 in there and say Hello World Video, and I'm going to go ahead and put a paragraph tag and put a little lorem ipsum in there and turn on my word wrap. So I just started typing lorem, and you get sort of some placeholder text come up. So that's a really convenient kind of shortcut to just putting some text in here, dummy text. So so this is my HTML file. Let's say we want to actually check this before we do anything with it in our repo. So we know this is an HTML file. We want to test it in our live server. So let me open up live server. So I did Command or Control Shift P on Windows, and I'm going to go to live server, and say we got a new window pop up here. So that works. So say I go and delete some text, save. There we go. So we're back. And it's popping up with the translation because it detects this as Latin. So just kind of ignore that for now. Cool. So let's say we now want to, here I'll just change this so it doesn't pop up anymore. I'll just say, this is my website, save. So it shouldn't pop up anymore. There we go. So let's say this is my web page. This is what I want to commit, and then see the changes in my repository here. So the first thing we need to do when we're just starting to work with this and with GitHub, we might have to set something up here. So if I type git status, I can see the status of my repository I'm currently in, and I can see my index file is not yet part of the repository, so I can type git add index and git status, and that's going to show me now, instead of it being read and untracked, it's now tracked. And so what I did was I staged, or added my file to be staged. So what I want to do now is type git commit -m, and then say like this is my index.html file, or adding, I can say adding index.html file. Okay, so then the first thing that happens here when you're brand new to using Git to make a commit is it's going to ask you to configure the global user email and name. So what you want to do is type in git config -- global user.email and your email address. So like that, and then git config global user.name, and just put your info in. And so what this is asking for is within Git, the tool on your computer now, it wants to know who you are to make the commit to this repository. So now I can try my command again by pressing up a couple times to get to my message, git commit, and go like this. And so like that, it created a commit, but this is not yet transferred or pushed to the repository that's actually on GitHub. This is just my local Git repository. So if I type git log, I can actually see the history of this repository, and I can see, okay, my initial commit, which is the very first one that was made, is what I see online, and now on my local machine I can see this most recent commit. It's committed, but it has not been pushed to the repository here yet. So the next step of the process is to push the changes, and in this case it's the addition of this index file to my repository. So I would type git push, and it's going to pop up this the very first time you set up GitHub. And so you want to sign in with your browser. Click this right here. And what this is going to do is it's going to authorize the Git credential manager to interface with your computer. So you say authorize, and then that's good. And then you'll see over here the command, in that case it finishes transferring over to your repository. So if I go here and I reload, I now have 2 commits, and I now see my index file in this repository. So if I go over here too on the commits where it says 2 commits, I can click on that and see the history of commits. So I only have my initial commit when I made the repo, and then I now have this commit, which I added my index file, and if I click on it I can see the same code there as right here. So that's great. So say now I want to make one more change. Say I want to add, let's say I want to add another header like h2. Let's say this is a new section, something like that. Save. And there's my live server. I can see that's what I should see. Good. And so now let's do the same thing. Git status. Okay, so we can see our file's been modified. So git add index. And I can see the changes are ready to be committed. So I say git commit -m. So I'll say added an h2 element. So that's my message. Cool. Okay, so now git push. And so we should see it push the changes here. They should be here now. It'll say 3 commits when I reload GitHub. Like that. So we can see right there, added h2 element. I can see the change right there. And we're good. So that's the very basics of working with GitHub to create a repository, clone it, add files to it, update it, and then push the changes back to GitHub. So if you were collaborating with somebody, you could go in here and just download a zip file, and they could work with the code. Or if they're familiar with GitHub and Git, they could clone the repo using this URL right here and git clone in the terminal and make changes and commit them. So the final step of this process, if you were to want to use this repository as a set of files that could be served to a web page, is to follow the GitHub Pages workflow. GitHub Pages workflow, where you are able to use the repo as the server. And what you want to do is pick project site, start from scratch, and essentially follow these same steps here, which we did. And in our case, all we need to do is this step right here. We need to configure our repository as a source to be able to generate a URL that will match what we see on our live server locally. So I'm going to go here, go to the settings for this repo, go down to pages, and right here where it says source, I want to go ahead and pick main. Click save. And so then what we get is a URL at github.io, which is a different domain, which is using the same repository name as we created here as part of the URL for the page. And so if I click on this, it's gonna potentially not work right away, and it might take a few minutes sometimes for this to refresh, or to the changes here to propagate. So you might just have to wait for a minute. And so what this allows you to do is create a repository, use it as a host essentially, and serve a web page from it. And as long as there's an index.html file at the top level in the repository like this, it will it should work fine. So let's go back here and try to reload it. So let's see. That's the URL. There we go. So this URL matches my repository here, and it's showing my index file. And that does match what my local host, my local server is running, which right now if I turn it off, it's going to stop running it. So if I try to reload this locally, it doesn't work anymore. But over here, this is live to the world, so you could go to this URL and you would see the exact same website coming from this repository. So just to recap, we went through setting up Git, configuring the terminal to work in VS Code, and setting up GitHub and creating a repo, and then making changes to that repo to then update the repository and create a GitHub page out of our repository source files. So if any part of that is confusing, you can always go back in the video and rewatch a step, or you can send me questions on Slack.